So this is an episode I've been planning and researching and trying to figure out how to do for a long time. What were the origins of the early European farmers? So there's many different names for these people, and I put down here just a few different names. Like, it's difficult to really choose any one of these things because all of them are intricately linked together, and there are all kinds of videos on any one of these topics. It's just as complex and interesting a history as the history of the Indo-Europeans, right? I'm going to cover a macro theory and map of all of them, how they all kind of originated from one general population. And with that scope stated, let's investigate. Right now, this channel has 3 different series of videos running concurrently, and usually they're trying to help each other out. We have Pantheon Overviews, which looks at the entire mythology and pantheon of certain cultures. We have Comparative Deity Evolution ones, and we have Comparative Anthropology or Ethnogenesis ones like this one. I've done an episode on the Etruscan origins, and I use that to talk about Voltumna, Etruscan king of the gods, and one on Cybele, kind of the Anatolian mother goddess or great agricultural goddess. And then I did 2 other videos on Dawn goddess and Dawn god. All of those are kind of feeding into this episode on the agrarian agricultural settlement of Europe. And my second video on ethnogenesis covered the Indo-European. And that prepares us to look at who was in Europe before the Indo-Europeans got there. So everything's kind of been building towards this video and future videos about other cultures around here and growing out from there. The goal is to ultimately cover the entire globe, actually. Also, there are always 4 different interdisciplinary metrics that I'm using and looking for when I'm trying to prove a hypothesis or formulate a map like this. It's not possible to draw these kinds of grand sweeping maps like this without looking at multiple disciplines. These 4 different metrics, I'd say, are mythology, linguistics, archaeology, and genetics. In order to draw a map, I don't need every single one to be completely confirmed, but I do try my best to confirm as many of these aspects as possible. Linguists might say that certain languages are isolated, that they can't possibly be related to other things, to other languages that are isolates. And that would limit my hypothesis because looking at archaeological and genetic data, there is a continuity of people in some of those groups, and there is a story, a map, a hypothesis I'm putting forth in the form of this map and this video as to why seemingly isolated languages, especially Paleo-European ones, as linguists call them, might actually be related. Maybe not all of them, but a good amount of them. And you can follow along all those different metrics as we go through here. Looking at this group, this is the most important group that we'll be dealing with today. Mythologically, I talked a little bit about the potential of the mother cult of Cybele, Rhea, originating from Anatolia. That video of the West Asian mother goddess has already been made. There is evidence that a sort of ancient cult and many deities might originate from Anatolia. So that's mythologically. Linguistically, there is an agricultural substrate of words in many languages throughout Europe that clearly have origins in this region. It's important to note that Anatolian sometimes is used as a term for the Luwian and Hittite Indo-European language family, and it's unfortunate that we have the same words for these things, but the Anatolians, the original Neolithic Anatolians, were not Indo-European. The Indo-Europeans did not get here by this point in 10,000-ish BC. Archaeologically is very clear. We know that the spread of the agricultural revolution came from this region, and it slowly spread westward into the rest of Europe from Anatolia. We also have a name for this group of people that archaeologists call the Anatolian Neolithic Farmers, or ANF. And before they became farmers, they were Anatolian hunter-gatherers. So a lot of hunter-gatherer groups eventually adopt farming and then spread it. I use Tash Tepler because that is the broad archaeological horizon around 10,000 to 8,000 BC that Göbekli Tepe is a part of, but also Karahan Tepe and other tepes and old Neolithic cities in southern Anatolia, right? So Göbekli Tepe is like right there. It was part of a large horizon of farmers and is nonetheless kind of the homeland and part of the story of what we're talking about here. Genetically, when they test a lot of these archaeological sites, they found a genetic signature that has already been corroborated between the archaeologists and the geneticists, correlating the Anatolian Neolithic farmers as a genetic signature that we can see throughout Europe too. And we can see even in contemporary populations a significant amount of Europeans have Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, right? So already looking at just this group, we have a hypothesis that makes sense, that's coherent. It works in 4 different disciplines. Another important thing to note here is that the Neolithic package, the Neolithic technology, which is generally called the West Asian Neolithic, so it's like wheat, barley, were spread out from the Natufian culture. So it is hypothesized, and I follow this hypothesis most strongly, that the Natufians were basically proto-Afroasiatic speakers. So Afroasiatic is a macrofamily, language family, including Semitic and Egyptian and Berber, Chadic, Cushitic, a bunch of different languages. They spread out from this area, roughly, and spread agriculture with them. When we look at genetic signatures in many different cultures in this area, around this period, from 10,000 to 7,000-ish, we have a population spread of people with this Levantine Neolithic farmer DNA that are making up proportions of the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, of the Subartians, which are like kind of northern Mesopotamians up in this region, and also of Anatolian Neolithic farmers. A small group of farmers joined many different populations and spread agriculture as a technology. There is some potential Afroasiatic basis to some of these agricultural concepts and words. Around 10,000 BC, Europe was mostly split up between 2 different general populations. There's the Western hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers. So the Eastern hunter-gatherers were a mix of Western hunter-gatherers and further Eastern ancestral North Eurasians, basically Paleo-Siberians. When these Anatolian farmers are spreading into Europe, they're going in to a place that has many hunter-gatherers, very sparsely populated groups of hunter-gatherers. A lot of them had very sophisticated fishing networks, and they actually had villages. Even the Iron Gates site, for instance, over here on the Danube, was a large fishing village way before the Anatolian farmers even got there. So fishing was like a major, like semi-sedentary lifestyle that was already in Europe during this time. Most of what the Anatolians are dealing with is Western hunter-gatherer. There is kind of a border between Eastern and Western right here. So yes, the Indo-Europeans do not exist yet. They will eventually be a merger between the Eastern hunter-gatherers here and the Caucasian farmers in this region. But that has not yet happened in 10,000 BC. So I'm going to break up these waves of migrations into 4 general steps. Lots of 4s today. The first of these migrations and steps is the Pelasgians in the south and the Danubians in the north. So the Anatolian Neolithic farmers took 2 main migration routes out of Anatolia. One was towards the north across the Dardanelles Strait into the Balkans. This group can be generally classified as early European farmer or linear bandwear archaeologically, or the Danubian farmers. I like to use river names for Neolithic or agrarian peoples because That's, of course, where they mainly settled. The highlands would be more inhabited by hunter-gatherers during this time as the transition happens. Like I said, there was already some early proto-villages in the region based around fishing, a lot of them around a lot of the lakes. But the thing is, we see a lot of villages made from wood in lakes because the wood falls into the lake and gets covered with a bunch of silt and clay, and it's preserved, right? So in general, if we're seeing preserved villages or houses made of wood in lakes in certain regions like we do heavily in this period in this region, we can assume that there were villages made of wood all over the place. So that's an important thing I don't think it's talked about enough. How much stuff in this period would have been made of wood and thatch and other things that are easily decomposed and would not be preserved. Part of the reason that we know so much about the Tash Templars is because they built a lot of things out of stone and clay and stuff that kind of preserved a little longer. Once they went into these northern regions that had plenty of wood to build with, we have a lot less record of them. Until later, when they would create megaliths, and we'd start to notice, hey, there's some sophisticated societies over here. And the assumption is that that's something they just started doing. I would venture to guess that these people might have been very pro-social and more organized than some might dismissively assume. And the Danubians in this time very likely had wagons. We have evidence of the Tash Templar having toys with wheels on them. So it could be assumed that wheels are quite old solid wooden wheel type thing. Again, wooden, so hard to preserve. They did have cows, so very likely they were traveling via land in wagons. So meanwhile, around the same time, 65 to 62-ish, in the Mediterranean, they definitely did have cattle and they brought them with them, but mostly it would have been boats. Again, wooden boats. The three main kind of areas of this expansion would have been Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean Islands. Cyprus had been actually used for hunting and all kinds of things going back to the Mesolithic and older, and there also were people, probably fishermen and other hunter-gatherers living on these islands too. But in terms of actually cultivating agriculture on it, it's the same kind of 6500 period. Like very quickly they spread out into these islands. And so why do I use the term Pelasgian to refer to these people? Now, it's definitely a controversial term to use because Pelasgian was a Greek term. The Greeks basically used it in their own sort of paleo-anthropology to explain who the people were that lived in Greece before they did, before the Indo-European Hellenic-speaking Greeks who were writing this down. They spoke about a people who were there before them and spoke a different language. So another word for this the Greeks used and threw around a lot was autochthonic, or autochthon, which really basically means indigenous. It means that they are from the land, from the earth, from the soil. They were there before these traveling Hellenic peoples got there. The Greeks specifically called out Eteocypriots as being the Eteo means true in Greek, so it's the true Cypriots, right? The original true Cypriots before the Greek Cypriots came in. And the same with Eteocretan. The Greeks and now archaeologists today notice that the Minoan civilization prospered and existed before Indo-Europeans got there. And in fact, the Mycenaeans, which were the earliest wave of Hellenic people into the Aegean, were specifically contrasted with the original Cretan Minoans. And then there's a little bit less said about many of the Aegean islands being specifically Pelasgian. The most famous one would be the island of Lemnos, which very late into its history had a significant portion of people speaking the Lemnian language, a language that is related to Etruscan, actually, and that even the ancient Greeks referred to Lemnian as being related to Etruscan, and they tried to explain it. Herodotus famously tried to explain it by saying that the Etruscans were actually from Lydia, and that they stopped in Lemnos before going to Etruria. But if you'll see from my Etruscan origins video, I don't believe that's what happened. If anything, this myth might be calling out to a very old migration that did happen from Anatolia to Lemnos and to Etruria in Italy, but not as late as he was saying. Because the Lydians were related to Hittites and Luwians. They were Indo-European. So clearly it wasn't they who spread the Lemnian and Etruscan languages. But that's the next step. The Eteocretans, for instance, the Minoans, were considered to have kind of run up into the hills, and they actually survived for quite a while on eastern Crete. Then they just had a few little refuges up in the mountains. And this is a common tendency that we'll see in a lot of this series, is that people who tend to have lived somewhere longest, they tend to migrate to the hills or escape to the hills, or at least the ones who live in the hills are the ones who preserve their unique culture the longest, because they're most isolated from the lowland populations. A lot of them would, of course, be mixing with them. It's not like they're completely displaced and pushed. Genetically, we still see some of the strongest signatures of Anatolian Neolithic ancestry in Crete. So I'm effectively taking a term that the Greeks themselves used for the people who lived there before them, and I'm repurposing it because there's plenty of hypotheses and plenty of ideas that the Greeks had about what the Pelasgians were. And the best possible reading, looking at all these different disciplines, to me, is that it refers to the Anatolian Neolithic farmers and their remnants. Technically, Pelasgian relates to Pelasgus, who is a historical figure, supposedly one of the first humans, another autochthon and an indigenous person of Greece, who his name became, or maybe it's the other way around, the Peloponnese is this peninsula here that is cognate with Pelasgia, which was the old name just basically for all of Greece. And it included, Pelasgians are referred to as living up here too. And that's accurate, actually. Some of the first places that were settled by these Neolithic farmers was over here in like Sesklo, on the coast of Thessaly, basically. So that's kind of close to Mount Olympus, which is like kind of over in that direction. And as you can see here, I have another line coming here, because obviously the Danubians will have migrated by land into Greece, as well as the sea route. But that right there is effectively step one. Step two of this Neolithic migration starts, at least in the south, as a stem from this Aegean Pelasgian sort of grouping. And that is generally called, I call it Tyrrhenian. So Tyrrhenian is a macrofamily language put forth by Helmut Rix. I talk about it a lot in my Etruscan origins video. It's currently made up of officially 3 different languages. One, of course, is Etruscan itself. Then there's Lemnian on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean. And then there's a third one that hasn't propped up yet because it doesn't exist yet in our current timeline. Ratian or Ratic. So those 3 languages are actually part of the Tyrrhenian language family. But there are extensions to that hypothesis which aren't proven, because they can't really be proven, which presumes that there were probably a lot more Tyrrhenian languages, especially around the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is right here, like Eteocypriotic, Sardinian, and Corsican Neolithic languages. So again, same idea with Sicily is the true Sicilians. A lot of Sicily by the time of the Greeks was settled by Greeks. Before that, it was actually invaded by Italic peoples related to Romans, and also Phoenicians made some settlements there. But before both of those groups, it was settled by a people that is kind of mysterious. We don't know much about them. We know that they were there, we know that they were farming since about 61,000 BC. Part of why we can basically insist that the Etruscan, Ratian, and Lemnian languages are all Tyrrhenian is because we have actual inscriptions. We have languages to work with, as limited as they all are. Their languages and their scripts are actually close enough that we can conclude that they are related in some manner. We do not have any scripts or languages that survive of Eteosicilian or Nuragic or Taurian. So Nuragic and Taurian are archaeological complexes. They are on Sardinia and Corsica respectively. But this is referring to not just Nuragic civilization, because that's like the height of their development, right? When we say something as a civilization, or even when we say something culture, we're not always referring to like that people and their current evolution. Sometimes we just call them different things for some reason. And that's just to make sense of like what cultural changes are happening in archaeology. But just because something has a different name in archaeology doesn't mean it's not the same people or even people speaking the same language. It's just these are different disciplines talking about the same people in different ways from different lenses. Were the first Sardinians Nuragic? Not necessarily, because that culture, that civilization developed much later. However, were the ancestors of the Nuragic civilization and culture this particular group of Neolithic farmers? Yes, they were. When you look at the genetics, that is proven out. In fact, if you look at the genetic signature of Sardinia in general, it is the most pristine remnant, genetically speaking, of the Anatolian Neolithic farmers. No other island and no other place in Europe has as much original Anatolian ancestry as Sardinia does. So that just proves how remote it is, how disconnected it has been throughout history, that Indo-Europeans and various waves of conquerors have not gone inland too far. They haven't like truly displaced the gene pool as much. The same is kind of true for Etruscan, because when you look at the archaeology of Etruscan, I'm effectively a radical for saying that Neolithic Italy and the Apennine culture represent Proto-Etruscan, or maybe Proto-Proto-Etruscan, because most archaeologists look at the Villanova and Terramare and all these different archaeological cultures as more contiguous with what the Etruscans would be referred to. And that's true, like the really developed form of Etruscan civilization that we're familiar with and that we refer to in archaeology as the Etruscans is definitely later than the Neolithic Italy, first farmers of Italy, and the Apennine culture. But the Apennine culture, Neolithic Italy, they still had all of these agricultural practices, and they still had cattle culture, and they had all these things that would become obviously basic parts of Etruscan culture. I mean, and it's the same people. There was a little bit more of steppe admixture at that point. Early on, there were a few pastoral steppe people coming into Italy and adopting Etruscan language, Etruscan culture. That's why when you look at the genetic signature in Etruria, you can and did see some steppe influence. It's not as much as you see in the Italic places around them. So like the Etruscans basically look exactly like we would model and assume a people who's descended from these Anatolian Neolithic farmers would look like before Indo-European influence. It's not as simple as, oh, we look at it from one frame and we say, oh, well, there's steppe people in the Etruscan civilization, so I guess they weren't pre-Indo-European. That would be a very ignorant thing to say. I've been reading this book titled Minoan, Etruscan, and Related Languages, a comparative analysis by the late Sergei Jatsimirski. Unfortunately, before he passed away, he wasn't able to finish his grand thesis. His notes were kind of collected and published as a really dense book, really. It's a lot of comparison tables and notes about linguistic changes and evolution correlations between everything we have of Minoan, linear A, linear B, Cypro-Minoan script, and then anything we can get and make sense of those of the Eteocypriot, Eteocretan languages in comparison to the Tyrrhenian languages like Lemnian and Etruscan and so on. But he was putting together a hypothesis of kind of a macro theory, a macro-Tyrrhenian theory, I guess I would call it. And a lot of times in linguistics, linguists can take different isolated languages and try to compare them and come up with a hypothesis that they might be part of a larger macro family, right? And there's all kinds of hypotheses out there. I've covered a lot of them in my research. I'm going to be showing off a lot of them in a lot of these videos from around the world. But this is another one of those. The whole premise is that what we call the Tyrrhenian languages, which currently only has these three pieces to it, might actually be a lot bigger and include not only these lost Sardinian, Corsican, and Sicilian languages, but also include Minoan and Eteocretan and other Aegean lost languages, potentially stemming from an even older Anatolian macrofamily. So this macro-Tyrrhenian theory is effectively my hypothesis as well. And part of coming to that conclusion is a weird paradox in the Tyrrhenian family. We are pretty certain that Lemnian is part of the Tyrrhenian family. The problem is Lemnian is all the way back here in the Aegean. And sometimes this is explained as the Etruscans correlating with one of the sea peoples, the Teresh, during their raids into the eastern Mediterranean, that they might have settled in Lemnos and kind of taken over the local population and took over kind of language and had their script and stuff, in which case Lemnian would be a direct kind of dialect of Etruscan. And that's why that happened. That's one hypothesis. I think that's certainly more believable than believing that the Etruscans were descended from an Indo-European Lydian language. But I'm not convinced, because there's an option for Pelasgian people to exist on Lemnos before the Bronze Age collapse, so before the sea people came running around. But even Herodotus claimed that the Lemnians and the Etruscans were Pelasgian. There's a consistent language to who these people are, what their origins are, and what they called them. And of course, we're talking about sources that were Indo-European Greeks coming into a place that was new to them. They would have an alien perspective on who these people are. They would have an exonym for them, and they would refer to all of them by kind of one word. But for my hypothesis of why this might be the case, using this map, Tyrrhenian in this case would be a kind of a misnomer for this language family. Ultimately, it would have to find a better word, maybe a Pelasgian macrofamily, or a Mediterranean macrofamily, or an Anatolian macrofamily. Anatolian is obviously not a very good word because there's already a branch of Indo-European called Anatolic, and that's already complicated as it is. Plus, certain civilizations like the Hattian civilization and their language, Hattic, are sometimes called Anatolian because they are in Anatolia. The reality is, I found it, and this is a totally different episode, the Hattians actually migrated. They were agricultural, but they migrated from the Caucasian Neolithic farmers over in Georgia. The Anatolian farmers seem to have mostly been in southern and western Anatolia. There is a bit of a divide right here in the middle of Turkey. There's actually a big plain, like a steppe unto itself. It's very dry. And then there's a big mountain range in between the Black Sea coast and this plain. So really there's two barriers between these people and these people for a long time. So that's another reason why Anatolian is not necessarily the best word. It doesn't always describe what's happening. So I would propose, honestly, Pelasgian is probably the best term for it. When we trace the archaeology of who first settled Italy and Sicily, this kind of region, the region that we would presume the Tyrrhenian language was from, the people who actually settled there were not necessarily straight out of like Crete or this part of Greece. It was actually over here in like the Epirus, Albania region. Those were some of the first people to go straight across into the boot and etc. And they came down here. So they were actually more closely aligned to Aegean and maybe a blend with some Danubian coming in here as well. And in that case, I suggest that the core Pelasgian language split off to Cyprus and Crete, and another into the Aegean, and that Aegean branch went off into the Tyrrhenian Sea and beyond. And at the same time, Lemnos is one of the remnants of this Aegean language. That's my way of making this make sense. Our names for Tyrrhenian are wrong. Naming it after the Tyrrhenian Sea implies that it developed over here rather than over here, where I think all of these languages truly developed. So hopefully that makes some sense. The other very important note is I mentioned the Teresh as one of the sea peoples. So it's actually very interesting when you look into the history of the Sea Peoples. There's a few different groups that seem to be referring to the Aegean region, including the Peleset, which I believe, and I think there are many accounts saying that they came from the eastern Crete before they settled Palestine and had become the Philistines. There are a lot of stories of the Pelasgians being kind of shuffled around, migrating around as they were being pushed around by the Hellenic peoples. Aside from that, the Eastern Mediterranean has a lot of basically proven sea peoples. The Teresh most likely were referring to the Etruscans, the Tyrrhenians. Leading up to the rise of Rome, the Etruscans were notorious pirates and notorious seafarers. They were very, very good at it. The Chardin are one of the most clear pointers to this Nuragic Chardinian culture and civilization. Then the Shekelesh, many believe, were referring to the Sicilians, the original. I mean, even some of the Italian immigrations into Italy might have spurred people like the Shekelesh to leave their home country and raid. In general, around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, which of course is not the period that we're looking at right now, this is way before that, but by that time there were a lot of migrations happening and a lot of Indo-European peoples were coming down into the Mediterranean, displacing Bronze Age empires. Many of these Bronze Age kingdoms and empires and leagues were non-Indo-European. The third wave of Anatolian Neolithic farmers into Europe was, I chose to call them Hercynian and Atlantican. The Hercynians represent a continuation of the Danubians up into Bohemia, Germany, and Poland, and also all the way into Scania, southern Scandinavia, and starting around 5600. They effectively represent like the Western linear band wear, an evolution of linear band wear, right? And through the course of their entire history, they would transition to the funnel beaker and the globular amphora. Those three are the main stages. Apart from the Balkans, they are one of the first places to be inundated by the Indo-European migration, specifically the later kind of corded ware culture. So yeah, I call them Hercynian because the Hercynian forest ranging all the way from Germany's Black Forest through Poland all the way into Belarus and so on. It's just this contiguous kind of wild woodland. They traveled up the Danube, and when they reached Bohemia and southern Germany, they basically split up, following the band of forests and following many of the rivers down into the river valleys and into the Baltic Sea, North Sea. Another piece of this that's quite important, it comes up a lot, is what I'm calling Podolian. And Podolia is kind of referred to as this real region here in essentially Moldova and a bit of Ukraine, right along the Dniester and Prut rivers here. It's where the Cucuteni Tripilia civilization developed, actually. Very sophisticated, very large cities, and they were kind of direct descendants of this Hercynian group and the Danubian group kind of meeting up here. These are the ones who were right next to the Yamnaya and would have been some of the first people to be displaced. We have evidence of Indo-Europeans raiding in the lower Danube region, and some evidence of castles and stuff being built up here by remnant Danubian populations, although obviously mostly they would have been trading with the early Yamnaya and other proto-Indo-European steppe groups. There may have been a little bit of conflict between them. In fact, I've talked in a few videos about the burned house horizon. The burned house practice started with the Podolians in this region right away. It's very old. It started even with some of the Danubians. They would ritually, every few years, burn down the whole city and then rebuild on top of it. And so they would create layers and layers of a tell or a hill after generations and build right back on top of it. Now, many suspect this might be a form of cleansing, refounding of a city, or even of prevention of plague, because some of these cities were the very first time that humans had been so densely populated into big cities, and a lot of animals very in close proximity to people, the makings of plague. It's of course hard to tell how many plagues there were in the human species before this time, but around the time that the Proto-Indo-Europeans were forming up, and just before they started spreading into Europe, there was a plague around 34 to 3000 BCE, and it was a pneumonic plague, much like the Justinian plague and also the Black Death. So this may have been one of the first major plagues on Earth. A lot of archaeologists are now proposing that this plague, among other things like climate change, is one of the main reasons that the Indo-Europeans were able to take over Europe so much, despite the fact of there being so many people living there beforehand in these cities. If we look at some statistics that I have here, you can see that there's a Neolithic incline, a population boom as the Neolithic spreads throughout Europe and creates a population boom. And then there's a decline and a collapse of the population around the time of that plague and around the time that the Indo-Europeans would be coming in. So yeah, this is a very important region having to do with the transition to Indo-European Europe, but nonetheless, there were a lot of people here. The other half of this wave, from about 6000 to 5000 BC, was the Atlantecan wave. And I call it Atlantecan mostly because its most famous iteration in archaeology and in pop culture really would be the Atlantic megalithic culture. And this is a culture that is designated by its building of megaliths. So it's another one where it's the same people as many other cultures before them. Archaeologically, really the beginning was the cordial ware, which is the pottery that the Tyrrhenians or the Pelasgians were bringing over from Greece and from the Eastern Mediterranean, and eventually it would grow into the Atlantic megalithic culture. They would start building lots of megaliths, and that megalithic strategy didn't just like stay in the West, it actually expanded out from the West into Britain and then over into here and back into Italy. It influenced the later building of Gigantesia in Malta. This is when Malta was settled by the Siciliats, by the way, is back around 6000 BC. So not long after they got here, they went here and settled it. But the Dar Dalam is a very early culture. They're not building megaliths yet. Gigantesia happens a lot later during the kind of megalithic culture spread. And that culture, that kind of idea, that plan moved from west to east, actually, of megalithic structures like that. Famously, this is where people would think of when they're looking at the Nuragic and the Taurean civilizations, because they're named, the Nurag, and a Tor is a tower. These are the big towers that they built, the stone megaliths that they built over in the centers of their cities. But this is one of those tower building cultures that seems to have stemmed from Sardinian, and then a bit of influence also from Iberia, I think. And that's the Teleots. Teleotic people and archaeological kind of civilization arised around the same time that the Nuragic and Taurean civilizations was going on. There were people settled there beforehand, but early on, the spread was mostly along the coast. The Iberians, who again are kind of a isolate, we have very little of their language left over, so it's hard to relate it to any other languages. But archaeologically and genetically, they seem to have been a pre-Indo-European people, a remnant. One piece of them is the Tartessians. And Tartessos is interesting because it actually comes up in Phoenician records and also in the Bible. It comes up shortly with the story of Jonah. Now, Jonah famously tries to escape Jaffa. Jaffa is a very important city in Palestine for a long time that was ruled by the Philistines and also by the Phoenicians for a time. He tried to run away Tartessos. So he was trying to go to the ends of the earth, essentially. And after the Bronze Age collapsed, the Phoenicians actually started to seafare outside of the Levant, and they founded colonies in Cyprus, and they went over into Sicily, found colonies in Sicily and southern Sardinia, and of course northern Africa all across it, including Carthage that everyone knows. the city of Cadiz on the mouth of the same river that Tartessos, the city, was on. And this was a Phoenician colony, a trade colony with Tartessos originally. Gadir, I mean, today it's called Cadiz. So another really interesting thing here, I don't think I've ever seen anything mention this, but there's a very curious thing that happens when you look at the archaeology of where farmers spread. Wouldn't you expect, if they were migrating across the Mediterranean, that they would find themselves on the opposite side of the Mediterranean? And yet what we find is around Libya and much of southern Tunisia, we don't see that. We don't see them spreading here during this time. We don't even see very much large agriculture that we can tell. Of course, there's a lot that has been swept away and absorbed by desertification in this region, and so that's a whole other question and a whole other episode about the Amazigh people and people who were in the Sahara during the Green Sahara period, and all the other hypotheses around this entire region about Atlantis, right? Nonetheless, over here, actually, you did have some farmers specifically coming from the Tartessian area, so like Iberia. The Iberian farmers, Atlantean farmers, were over here crossing the Strait of Gibraltar and settling North Africa here. Another bad name in archaeology is the Neolithic of the Tingitana Peninsula. The Uedbet is a kind of extension of that. They spread across all of it. It's just like a very under-researched culture. But they definitely stemmed from Iberian farmers of Anatolian descent. And they took in a lot of Iranian or Ibero-Maurutian North African hunter-gatherers. So the interesting thing about the time is when they got here, they actually got here before the Amazighs did. So when they got here, they were not interacting with Amazigh like shepherds and herders from the Middle East, from Egypt and the Levant yet. They were still working with hunter-gatherers that are part of essentially a ghost population. This ghost population would have been probably the closest relatives to the Afro-Asians, but they were those that stayed in North Africa during the Green Sahara period. Only a bit later, after 4000, around 35 to 3000, did the actual Amazigh shepherds and herders start coming into this upper region and mixing with this Atlassian population. So the other thing about that is that there was a large Capsian culture that was quite early, again, more around the 7,000, 6,000 range, that set itself up right here in this region and seemed to have a pretty sophisticated system and society and needs to be looked into more. There's a recent hypothesis I watched of a video talking about how this is one potential pillar of Hercules going into a lake that used to be here and that used to be fed by a large plain Green Sahara region. These rivers flowed down in here, and then some others flew down here towards the eye of the Sahara. That's the other Atlantis potential thing. So those two are both really interesting hypotheses, all pointing towards a time, and this is a time where the Sahara was indeed green. I'm forcing the word a little bit. You know, I called them Atlantecan and then I got Atlassian. But the other reason I call them Atlassian is actually based on actual mythology. So a lot of people don't talk about this either. Atlas has a twin brother. His name is Gadirus or Eumelus. And Eumelus means rich in sheep. And Gadirus, of course, was a kind of an exoname given to him, another name given to him for Gadir or Cadiz, that Phoenician founded city. But again, that was later. He was associated with Tartessos and Atlas with the Atlas Mountains and North Africa, right? The Amazigh and Berbers actually, according to the Greeks, worshipped Atlas as like their main god. If you look into the Libyans and a few other groups, you'll find Atlash is one treatment, and there's Ash and Ashaman and Akamon, and these are like the high sky father figure. He, like Atlas, was associated therefore with the heavens and with the celestials. One might say potentially these mountains, which were given his name, and the Greeks said that he was these mountains, right? Is there some point at which the Pillars of Hercules, these two land masses were considered to be kind of twins of one another. I don't know, this is something I discovered and I was like, huh, that's interesting. Because if these Atlassians were Pelasgian, it would make a bit of sense why there's so much of that Atlas type stuff in Greek mythology. But also the Mediterranean was, for a time, especially the Bronze Age, a huge trading network where copper and tin would be traded from here all the way into the Bronze Age empires of the Middle East. Here on the northern end of the migration, we have probably one of my most controversial hypotheses, because the linguistic data is not like super rich. The Basque language is a famous isolate and a famous Paleo-European language. There have been many attempts throughout the years to try to find a relationship between Tyrrhenian and Etruscan languages and the Basque language. They can continue to find the same agricultural core language features that are really shared throughout the Mediterranean, but there seems to be enough of a difference between the languages, it's difficult to, purely from a linguistic perspective, reconstruct the two together. And of course, there are a lot of later layers. The Vascones were around during the Romans. The Romans referred to them as such. And the Romans attempted many times to assimilate the Basque, but they kind of held up in their mountain valleys and resist assimilation for a long time, until even today. Even today, Basque is still a pretty widely used language in the Basque country of Spain, and they have a lot of autonomy. So a sister language of Basque, almost a dialect of Basque, is Aquitanian. And Aquitanian is another Roman term for the region here in southwestern France. That language is also lost to us, it's dead, but it lives on as a substrate in the Occitan languages. Even the word Occitan comes from Aquitanian. And those are kind of southern Romance languages. This whole area seems to have a deep linguistic and cultural reservoir that is heavily influenced, and I forgot to mention the Gaulish Celtic influence in this entire area. So the Celts influenced Iberia very deeply once the Indo-Europeans came into Iberia, and we refer to those mixed Celtic Iberians as Celt-Iberians. And over here in France, the Celts that settled here, many of them mixing with Aquitanians and people who would have lived there beforehand, became Gaulish. So when we look at Gaulish and Celt-Iberian, we are potentially looking at things that could have some Basque or Aquitanian features. Anyway, Basque had, for a while, people thought it might have an even older Paleo-European influence, be it a hunter-gatherer language, like Western hunter-gatherer. But when they did the genetic study about the makeup of Basque ancestry, they found out that, once again, the main ancestral component that sets them apart from other people near them was not that they had a larger percentage of Western hunter-gatherer, but actually that they had a pretty large percentage of Anatolian Neolithic farmer. From that perspective, it makes the most sense that Basque might be related to other Iberian languages like Tartessian, and could stem from this potentially Tyrrhenian and Pelasgian variant. I'm preparing a few episodes on Basque mythology and also a chart, and I find it very fascinating. There's a lot to it that has a Pelasgian flavor to it. Deities that are very chthonic in that way that Etruscan Minoan are. Iberian is a lot more broken. We really have to look at a lot of Celtiberian sources and deities to see it, but there are some chthonic features in those religions too. If you want to learn something really interesting, look into the Basque. So the fourth and final wave or step of Anatolians into Europe is actually a combo. Up here in northern France and in Rhineland and all these kinds of areas, the Hercynians from the Danubian branch and the Aquitanians met each other, and they started to mix and combine the technologies over here. And this became one of the strongest places where the megalithic culture kind of excelled, although of course it happened all the way down here and then up into Britain. And together they started to settle Britain and do agriculture there, and also started to open up some of the first tin mines, which would become, of course, extremely important in the following Bronze Age, trading them all the way into the Mediterranean, either by land or most likely actually all the way around by sea. I've chosen to refer to this wave as Nemedians. Nemed is their kind of ancestral named father, right? That could all be complete fantasy. Nonetheless, when you look at the Irish Book of Invasions, which is what I'm referring to with these different waves of people, by the way, each one represents not just a people, but a set of gods and a layer on top of Irish history that is kind of being told and retold throughout time, which the Celts did. I used to want to say Fomorians. The problem with Fomorian as a premise is the way they're described is more akin to the Western hunter-gatherers who would have been living in Britain before the Nemedians got there. So like cavemen, and not necessarily agrarian or agricultural. They were called dark-skinned, and technically the Western hunter-gatherers had relatively dark skin. It's actually the Anatolian farmers that spread some light skin features from Anatolia. The Eastern hunter-gatherers also spread some light skin that they got from ancestral North Eurasians. The Nemedians, and then immediately after them the Furbolg, are considered seafarers and agrarians, agriculturists, farmers. The Furbolg specifically are called the farmers. The Nemedians specifically are called like avid, really good seafarers coming to Ireland and to Britain from the mainland. Nonetheless, there is linguistically a lot of evidence that Irish in particular and Gaelic languages, those are the oldest, most insular forms of Celtic in Britain, have a lot of inexplicable words and kind of structures in their language that it doesn't fit perfectly with an Indo-European system. So Julius Picerni is probably the best source for putting this insular Celtic substrate hypothesis together in a kind of more reasonable way. There are other theorists before him that proposed this agrarian substrate under Irish was of Semitic or Afro-Asiatic origin. And like we said, because Afro-Asiatic has a significant portion of agricultural words that it contributed to the Anatolians, that is not, oddly enough, a completely insane idea as much as we might originally think it is. But in general, no, the Anatolians were not Semitic. I didn't have a specific word for up here, but it's a little bit later that the Hercynians and the kind of Nemedian Aquitanian mixture comes into southern Scandinavia and Jutland right here. After these two came together over in northern France, they started to move to the east and influence a lot of these Danubian cultures. There was a few different genetic studies kind of looking into the globular amphora, and they'd found that actually a lot of the farmers that were living over here during that later period were descended from this western Atlantic Mediterranean branch of Anatolians and not as much from the Danubians. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? Now, it's not like they took over entirely. That same migration seems to have also influenced kind of the later Aquitanic Tripilia as well, kind of supercharged it. That's really interesting because that means if you look at Indo-Europeans later coming into Eastern Europe, you might expect them to be mixing with purely Danubian branch of Anatolians, but no, they were actually mixing with both branches together everywhere they went. It was effectively like one large early agrarian European continent with lots of trade and lots of exchange and travel between them, especially during the High Bronze Age. And with that, I think that's probably enough to draw the picture and to hopefully lead to some understanding of who was in Europe before the Indo-Europeans, whatnot. Hopefully this can help you look at and see, okay, are they pre or post-Indo-European? If you see it in the Aegean and also in Ireland, and it wasn't brought there by the Greeks, it wasn't brought there by later sources or Christians, then it's possible now not to immediately assume that it must be Indo-European. It could be something that actually came from this long journey across the Mediterranean and up across the Atlantic into Britain, right? So that's just one example of how you can look at this and use it to make sense. As always, thank you for watching. I appreciate any comments or critiques that you might have. Like the video to help me in the algorithm, and also, it's a little weird, but if you like this backdrop I had specific words in all of these books. This one's the only ones that remain in Star Atlas and World Atlas. I specifically named all the books, and they auto-scrambled them. So yeah, I mean, they're on a discount right now. On the other hand, you like something a little simpler, just kind of a pretty tapestry. We have a new design of a rainbow mandala in black, dark mode, essentially. I like it. This is one of my favorite symbols. It's also on the website, and we have all kinds of charts and other things. My business partner and I do all of this on our own, including the research. So if you appreciate the work we do, we like to make actual products that you can take and use and appreciate, that aren't just, you know, t-shirts that you won't wear or a mug that, I mean, no one uses. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.